Hi all of y'all. Today I would like to give a lecture on the cultural controversies that were associated with the film Deepa Mehta's film Fire. Just before listening to my lecture, if you can all see the film, it's there in YouTube. You can just go through the film. I'm sure many of you all must have seen it before, but it would be a very close reference if you go through the film once, because whatever I'm going to discuss today is particularly based on the film Fire, and we would like to look into the cultural controversies that are associated with the film Fire, with its release in the year 1998. And it's a film by Deepa Mehta, the NRI director. So, what was the issue at stake? Let's look into that. What was the issue at stake when the film Fire was released? Was the issue on Indian nationhood? Was the issue on family and household? Was the issue on female sexuality? Was the film an issue about various cultures and the reading of different cultural texts in different ways? We will uncover all these points through the course of this lecture. You see, the film Fire was released in the year December 1998, and after quite a number of weeks of its release, after it's being screened and then its release, there was a number of headlines in newspapers regarding the film and the banning of the film, etc., etc. A lot of groups came into this: the political group, the cultural groups, the socio-religious groups, etc. In fact, it leads into something called the zone of contestation. Any cultural product, rather, can be read as a zone of contestation, to use the phrase used by Stuart Hall. What is the zone of contestation? It is basically a territory, a site on which various interest groups and interests struggle for hegemony. And the film Fire, we will look into how intersects various groups into a lot of into a lot of fights and struggles to get a hegemony. Ultimately, there is no answer. We'll look into that. So the film Fire had raised a lot of questions regarding the Hindu culture, Indian nationhood, middle class family life, patriarchy, heteronormativity, heteronormal culture, etc., etc., in the Indian scenario. And we would rather say that, at the very outset, we can just say that if you read it a bit more sociologically, we can say that the film Fire had been completely a national landmark of Hindutva politics and culture bashing. You have, number one, the Gandhi bashing, because you have the elder brother over here, played by Ashok, who was completely Gandhian and had been a loser in his life till the end of the film. Secondly, the second bashing was the bashing of the theory of desirelessness, which once again is a kind of a, covert understanding and appraisal of the philosophy of Maya, that is illusion, which is so very predominant in India. Thirdly, the bashing of Ramayana, because Ramayana was reread and reworked various times in various ways in the film as it has been portrayed. And finally, the Hindu joint family bashing. So we can read the film Fire at the very outset in a cultural context as the Hindutva politics and religion, patriarchy, heteronormativity bashing, as a session of bashing. But when one looks into the entire context of the release of the film Fire, we see how the Shiv Sainiks, particularly, had a lot of issues regarding the film Fire. Why? Simply because it showed the lesbian desire. It showed a kind of a desire that is extremely, quote unquote, spoiling for women of India. And here, the very famous quote of Bal Thackeray was that the film can be re-released. He would allow the film to be re-released on the condition that the two characters over here, played by Shabana Azmi as Radha, the elder sister-in-law of the family, and Nandita Das as Sita, played by as the younger daughter-in-law in the family, could be renamed as Shabana and Saira. If these two names were given to these two characters, then the film could have been allowed to re-release. When we look into this political intimation and reading of the film of Fire, we understand we can view it as three levels of otherization process. The first othering process is that the spoiling of women due to a kind of Western culture. So it is a we, that is the Indian nation, the culture of India, to the other, which is the West. No matter how alien it is charming, it is Occident, it is a charming, alien, Occident culture, which is the other to the Indian culture, that is we. The second level of othering takes place on the grounds of sexuality, and particularly on the ground of women's sexuality, that is the issue of lesbianism. The issue of lesbianism is a sexual construction, is a sexuality, it's a practice of sexuality, it's a cultural practice of sexuality, which is once again other to the Indian motherhood and sexuality of female. Third otherization takes place, of course, with Bal Thackeray's famous quote that Shabana and Saira would be important and would be okay, he would be okay with both of these, simply takes place on the communal ground. So the othering process at the third level is understood in terms of the Muslim other and the Hindutva Indian national culture. So these three otherization process actually can be read from the entire context of the political, socio-religious, cultural understanding of the film Fire. Going on to the next one, when one looks into, when one reads the film Fire, one has to conjure up a lot of issues, cultural, political, etc., which I have already mentioned before. But here one can look into how the entire film was revolving around a kind of a war and anti-war against Hindu traditions. It is here that one can look into and realize how the Hindutva religious, socio-political, cultural reading of a cultural text of the film Fire can lie absolutely at bay when one reads into the intricacies of female desire, female choice, female sexuality, which were very hush-hush terms, definitely at the time when the film was released in 1998. Once again, we would also locate how the film in the cultural political scenario had created a kind of a worldwide movement, which was the lesbian movement, the LGBT community movement, which was actually understood as a diasporic movement. And when this entire movement brought into a kind of a cultural climax where everyone, every citizen of the country was looking at the film Fire as something which is completely alien, something which is completely foreign, something which is which is not a part of tradition. It is almost a kind of going against the Indian tradition. And one may also here locate how Stuart Hall talks about culture. What is the meaning of culture, and how can one read the entire culture as two ways? There are two lenses of reading culture. The first one, as Stuart Hall says, is a kind of a culture which unites, a kind of a culture which is stable, which is immutable, which is actually the Indian culture that is read in terms of, Indian culture is read in terms of an immutable sense of, stagnancy, etc. And as a result of this, the entire Indian immutable, stable culture has been read in terms of we. So no matter how many others you have in sight, how many multiple characters you have in sight, but you finally conform to the hegemonic, the conforming, circumscribing culture to which you belong to, making yourself feel a part of the solid group, the solidarity that you form as belonging to one culture. The second lens reading is when the different identities or the elements, which is of course the different human behavior, goes against the culture or is different from what the expectations of the quote unquote normal, the circumscribing, the dominating culture deserves and desires from you. So here it is at this point that a hybridity of culture develops, and the film Fire can be located and read in terms of this hybridity of cultures, because it tries to understand, it tries to represent and portray a number of characters which are actually going against the predominating culture, that is the Hindu patriarchal heteronormative culture. At the same time, it is the director's toying with the film Fire that helps to once again declare a kind of a war and an anti-war against the culture. So it is a kind of a complexity that one can read into how the film Fire had been represented through its various characters. So we are looking into, therefore, the entire cultural text and the Hindu political nationhood of the country, its traditions, which is at one point of time represented through the film as immutable and stable. I will tell you the instances which portrays this, and at the same time a cultural hybridity, a possibility of transgression from this entire dominating culture, which is extremely interesting, and the way Deepa Mehta represents it. So I will quickly just read into how the film is basically representing a war between culture and anti-culture. Fire actively promotes the othering of pornography by suggesting that pornography's primary function is to corrupt. The potential objects of such corruption range from the non-middle class men like the servant Mundu to the bodies and minds of children. Through these self-reflexive gestures, Fire effectively emanates from the aesthetic levels, elevates itself onto an aesthetic level of distinction unsullied by the immorality associated with pornographic sex. Gradation of culture is also echoed here when the younger son Jatin, played by Javed Jafri, sells porn cassettes and CDs and does not get any condemnation, while Mundu becomes the figure portrayed as a corrupted mind for seeing porn. At the same time, the two daughters-in-law, dressed in heterosexual fantasy and dancing to a Bollywood track, is also not conforming to the stable culture. But this is compromised and negotiated with, unlike that of pornography. So you see here, pornography is something which is extremely hush-hush, which is something extremely corrupting. And Fire keeps to this corrupting culture. This culture of Fire conforms to this culture, rather, of showing that pornography is something which is actually corrupting. Okay, there's no two ways to it. So here, the film Fire, through its representation, is trying to conform to the culture. And on the other hand, when it is showing and representing the two daughters-in-law dancing in a heteronormative couple dance to a Bollywood track, it shows how the film is once again transgressing from the heteronormative dominating heteronormative culture. So here once again you see how the film Fire becomes a site on which the war is fought between culture and anti-culture in the Indian society and Indian traditions. Moreover, now we look into, so far we've talked about culture, now we look into the class caste gradation system that was represented in the film. Very simply, in the film, the servant Mundu, who masturbates, who is shown to masturbate by seeing pornographic films, he provides a comic relief. Why? Because he belongs to a lower class. He is completely uneducated and he is a lower class person. As a result of which, the fact that he is a marginal, he belongs to a marginal class, his sexuality is providing a comic relief, as against these two daughters-in-law, the two women of the middle class Hindu family, whose sexuality and whose sexual desires become extremely serious to to occupy the entire space, the screen space of the film Fire. So here once again we see that the two classes, the two women of the middle class Hindu family, their sexuality, their sexual desires are treated seriously, whereas Mundu, who is the servant of the house, his sexual desire is giving a comic relief. So here we find how the class intersects with the culture in order to provide the gradation, and the film Fire also has not come out of this class discrimination. In fact, Mundu has been played, I mean in the film it is shown that Mundu was condemned by Radha, the elder daughter-in-law, because he was seen to masturbate seeing a porn film. But what about the sexuality of these two women? We'll come to it. The entire film once again talks about another thing, and now we go look into the another factor as to how the female sexuality and female desire is being played with in the film Fire. How? You see, the entire film is showing how these two women are falling for each other, are being sexually attracted to each other because they had had a very, very submissive sexual life with their heterosexual in their heterosexual relationship with their husbands, as a result of which, due to their incapability of fulfilling their desires in an marital in a heteronormative marital relationship, do they turn towards each other, portraying lesbian sexuality. So no matter how much Mehta shouts, Deepa Mehta says that whatever the film is about choices, it is actually not about choices. The film is not showing an intentional, a kind of a choice, a free choice of lesbianism. It is a compulsive lesbianism because these two women fail to get their sexual desires fulfilled by their heterosexually married husbands. So this once again shows how the film is actually not bringing in lesbianism as a choice, as a choice of female sexuality, because as it is often understood by the Indian culture, the Indian tradition, that Indian sexuality is a feminine sexuality of Indian women is something which is a mantle, which is something extremely pure. So women who are out of it, they cannot be pure. And at the same time, the middle class patriarchal family in which these two women are located is shown to disrupt because of these two women's relationship. So the film Fire is once again reading Indian tradition, Indian culture in a kind of a very politically neutral way, keeping it immutable, to some extent not delivering the fact that lesbianism can be a choice for Indian women. So this part is extremely important to understand how culture and sexuality and the reading of sexuality is shaped and circumscribed by the predominating culture. In this case, of course, the Hindu middle class, heteronormative patriarchal culture. Moreover, there's also another very critical scene that when the two women make out, when they fulfill their sexual desires, making out in their bedroom, the keyhole serves as a point through which the husband, that is Ashok, that is the elder brother, along with Mundu, that is the servant, sees this. Now the question is the reversing of the male gaze. So far we've always read innumerably that it is the male gaze on the female body, not on the female desire. Here it is shown how the male gazes at the female desires. But the question once again comes up, crops up, is, the unleashed question here is, can there be anything about female gaze and female desire? So this question remains, unsolved in Deepa Mehta's film, because the gaze is not at the woman's body but at the woman's desires. So this is something which was once again a very, it was something which was transgressing from the Indian tradition, but nevertheless it crops up another question of female freedom and sexuality. Another thing which is very important, which comes up to in one's mind when one sees the film Fire's ending. The film Fire ends when the two women finds solace in a Muslim dargah. Now, dargah is actually a cultural space which is constructed as the other. The Muslim religious space is constructed to be other to the Hindu politics and the Hindutva tolerance and judgmentalism. As a result of which, when the film ends, when Deepa Mehta tries to close the film with the two women meeting each other in dargah, she fails to show the two women protagonists who have dared to be lesbians, though by compulsion, to find and attack back the heterosexual, heteronormative Hindu middle class patriarchal culture. It is very simple to understand that this particular Hindu middle class patriarchal heteronormative national culture is not a cultural space to provide solace to these two women who have found sexual desires which is considered to be the other in the form of sexuality. So here the ending, which Mary John calls to be something of a romantic closure, was something which once again defeats the entire purpose, the entire feminist purpose, if at all the film Fire had. Because they found a space, a cultural space, which is very different, which is again absolutely the other to their own cultural space. And here once again Indian traditions, Indian culture is seen to be represented as represented and respected as intact and immutable. So with these various understandings of the film Fire, I would like to end by saying that we really understand how the cultural texts of today are read through the socio-political, cultural, historical contexts. However, if one looks into the 19th century understanding of female sexuality, the revivalists and the reformists, the national social reformers, they have all identified with a feminine sexuality of Indian women, that of being a mother, that of being a pure body which is to be placed, kept inside the inner domain, the pure domain. This feminine sexuality does not have choice, does not have a space to account for their desire. And once again, the film Fire is, though, dared to show that there can be certain desires, that there can be that one can go against the entire theory of desirelessness and the entire understanding of Maya or illusion, but at the same time the culture, the predominating culture, remains intact by just eliminating these elements. So just the closure of the film shows how the entire predominating Hindu middle class patriarchal heteronormative culture has eliminated the two elements Radha and Sita because of their choice, though a forced, a compulsive choice of a feminine sexuality which is known as lesbianism. So this is how one can read the film Fire, and I had referred to Tejaswini and Mary E. John's article on mirroring politics in the Hindutva region of the film Fire. So please go through this entire reading which I have read, and please listen to the lecture. So these points of various understanding of, I mean, these points should be there in your answer when you are writing about the film Fire. Definitely, first you will talk about culture. To just recapitulate very briefly, first we will talk about the different culture and cultural contestations. As I said, to use Stuart Hall's zone of contestation. Then you have to look into how feminine sexuality becomes a part of the Hindu tradition and Hindu culture. You have to locate how the entire film Fire is actually a kind of a session, a Hindu, a landmark national Hindu bashing session. Then you have to look into the caste and class politics in representation of the film Fire. And finally, you will have to end with how the film Fire is actually a site of a war between culture and anti-culture in the Indian scenario. In fact, the most outstanding comment that John makes is that the two things which once again shows that the film Fire cannot be accepted in Indian society. Number one is the film itself is directed by Deepa Mehta, who is an NRI. So she is a director who is in Canada. So definitely, as Bal Thackeray had once commented, that it is the Western virus. Of course, the film Fire is a Western import, and definitely because it is directed by a person who is a non-resident Indian. So these two once again defeat the entire feminist understanding. If one would also look into the film Fire through a feminist lens, these are certain controversies which come up, and these are the controversies which have been unleashed by Mary E. John in the article which I referred to while explaining this. Thank you. All the best.